Hey everyone, I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today, and we're excited to bring you a special episode of our interviews podcast. It's 500th episode, a time to celebrate the amazing experience that we've had here at Healthcare IT Today, interviewing some of the top leaders in health IT. And I have two of my colleagues, my peers, my friends, excited to celebrate this achievement of 500 episodes. We have Colin Hung. Welcome, Colin.
Hello, John. Love being on the program.
Yeah, thanks so much. And really the person responsible for the success of the Healthcare IT Today interviews podcast, who doesn't get the FaceTime, but probably should get more FaceTime, Brittany Quemby. Welcome, Brittany.
Hi guys, thanks for having me.
Excited for today's discussion. Kind of a look back at the years we've been doing the interviews podcast. This is really interesting for me because, as a blogger, 18 years ago when I wrote the first blog post on Healthcare IT Today, which was, I guess, originally MR and HIPAA, like it's weird for me to think that we're so deep into video and audio and now we have 500 video and audio episodes of the Healthcare IT Today interviews podcast. What do you think? 500 episodes, crazy.
It's crazy to think about, I think when I started, working with you guys, we were so much copy, focused, and we were doing a lot of, articles. As you said, started as a blogger and kind of morphed into where we are now. But, I think putting the onus on video at a time when not many people were doing video was really interesting, cool to be able to do. And now to see where we are, what is it, 4 years later, it's actually really incredible to see and to be a part of.
Yeah, I mean, with at the time, I remember when we started, John, it was like it was all written stuff, right? And we had four websites that we were posting things on, and then we consolidated it, and then we decided one day, hey, like we got this thing called Zoom. Let's we just record it and see what happens and post those up on the website along with the written stuff. And yeah, it's funny to see how it's taken off. Never would have thought we got to get to 500 this quickly.
Well, and it's funny because you guys probably don't even remember this because you probably shouldn't have watched these old videos that I did. I remember one time I pulled out my cell phone and just held the phone and did a video interview with Jonathan Bush from Athena Health, and it's pixely and it's shaking and it's awful, like it's embarrassing stuff. I tried multiple times. I even had this. Dang, there was this camera that Cisco bought and then shut down, a little mini HD camera that I'd used for 4 or 5 videos at HIMSS. I'd tried, but it was like the cost to produce was so much that now I look at those videos and I'm just embarrassed. Even Google Hangouts. Do you remember Google Hangouts? I tried a few on there, but it was like I literally had to remote into people's computers and like enable their camera to be able to work with Google Hangouts to make it work. And so it was like, nah, this is not sustainable.
So you were, literally the OG healthcare influencer, with your phone with Jonathan Bush.
I mean, it was so funny, right? You look at it, and Jonathan Bush is just as dynamic as ever, but man, the video quality was terrible.
Well, I think we really have the pandemic to thank for everyone learning how to use the webcams, right?
Yeah.
Before it was the minority of people who had used Zoom, or back then it was, GoToWebinar or WebEx, right? Like you didn't use those tools very often. And then, during the shutdowns and lockdowns, and we all had to learn how to use these tools. And that's when everyone's like, oh, that's what those buttons are for, and that's what the mute button does. And and now it's like we're all used to it. And so it makes making videos, especially using Zoom now, so easy because everyone knows how to use it. Everyone has it on their desktops, and it's not a big deal anymore. But I still remember those first few that we did on Zoom, and you had to like send instructions for people, right? Like, here's what you do, right? Here's how you turn the camera on, and don't worry, when you get on, you'll be muted, but just click this button and you'll be unmuted. And even Zoom didn't have all those other options that it has now, right? Where you could, automatically say, okay, don't mute people when they join. Anyway, it's so much easier now, and it's so much better, and people are used to talking to cameras, so it's the interview quality has gotten a lot better as well.
And people have a
Yeah,
backdrop they're willing to share.
That's
we've
right.
certainly come a long way. You mentioned the pandemic. So can one of you talk about what the origin of the Healthcare IT Today interview podcast was?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little accidental, I would say. It certainly wasn't accidental that we were doing interviews, but coming out of the pandemic, Colin had this really awful idea, awfully good idea, maybe I should say. He's like, let's do 100 interviews in 100 days. So I don't know if people remember way back when. And so we started doing them, right? And it was kind of a way to give back to the community who was struggling, obviously, because of the pandemic, and we were all struggling to some degree. And so we tried to do it. I think it took more like 200 days, 300 days. I don't know. It took longer than 100, but we did it. And, I think 75% or so were video interviews. And I saw that, and I remember thinking, man, we have to put this out as a podcast. Like, it's already a podcast. We're just not publishing it that way. And so we kind of pushed it out there and said, hey, we got these, at the time, probably it was 30 interviews, 50 interviews, that we'd finished. And I was like, let's push this out as a podcast. So, the podcast was almost accidental because we had so much content from the videos we'd done.
Yeah, it's true. I remember like it was that 100 in 100 days idea just came about because at the time, like literally everything was stopped, right? Like no one could do any business. No one was buying anything other than PPE, right? At the time. Um, you know, so this was our way of trying to, or the idea came about to try and find a way to at least get the word out there for IT companies who were a little bit struggling at the time. So we kind of put a focus to interview, well, we interview anybody, but like interview CIOs to see what's going on from their perspective, but also interviewing folks from health IT companies. And John's right. I mean, we started with video and Zoom because that's all we could do, right? No, there were no conferences or anything. And then yeah, John had the idea to take those videos and turn them into podcasts as well. So we would simultaneously or near simultaneously release the video and the podcast. And I didn't. I first, I gotta be honest, I didn't think the podcast was going to take off. I thought, who wants to listen when you can watch? But it turns out there's two different audiences, right? Those that love to watch those interviews and those that like to listen to those interviews. And so I'm glad we made that decision to put both formats out.
Well, and I should say, people actually do probably know Brittany, since Brittany's the intro to every single podcast. They probably do. They get to
Those poor
finally put a
people
face
listening to
with
my
the
voice every
voice.
time.
You're the voiceover talent here at Healthcare IT Today. So,
Oh. Well, and Colin, you talked about a little bit, not thinking that the podcast would do, as well as video, but did you guys think that it would grow to what it is today?
No, pretty no. I mean, at the time when we started doing the videos and the podcast, there weren't that many people doing video. Like there wasn't a lot of YouTube channels out there dedicated to health IT. There still isn't, because it's such a niche area, right? So the videos I thought would do pretty well because there weren't that many around. But on the podcast side, there were a lot of really nice, really well done podcasts out there in healthcare. So I didn't know how well the podcast would do because it was, in my mind, it felt crowded.
Mm.
But it turned out that it wasn't as crowded as I thought it was, and each of us have a unique voice. And so, over the years of doing this, it always is surprising to me that how many people come up and will talk about the podcast. So no, honestly, I did not think the podcast would do as well as it has. It's continuing. I mean, I'm always grateful for how much for being able to do 500 episodes. So anyway, that's from my perspective. Honestly, like I never expected it to get here.
yeah, and there's two layers for me. One is that I didn't think we would shift from the mindset of if someone pitches us, like let's do a video versus hey, let's write an article about this company. Like that has fundamentally shifted for healthcare IT today, I think for all of us. Sure, we'll write the occasional article here or there, but if you're pitching me, I'm either going to give it to bonus features or I'm going to give it to like one of our other simple outlets, or I'm going to
Mm.
say, yeah, I like this story enough that I'm going to say, let's hop on video. And that was like a fundamental mind mind shift, that happened that I didn't expect at all, right? Like that growth from I want to write an article to let's do a video interview, and that's like kind of the default go-to if we want to tell a story. That was the first change that was like a bit shocking to me, especially as someone who's written, 7,000 articles, right? Like I would have never thought that would happen. And then the second one that was really interesting to me was how many people were excited to do paid video.
Mm.
Because we'd done paid articles for a long time. We'd done a lot of sponsored articles that people would do, and they'd buy series of articles, and they were interested in it, and they saw value in it, and they saw some impact from it, right? And in fact, those that did it loved it. And so I wasn't sure how that would play out in video, where you have to charge a lot more because the production's a lot more and the distribution's a lot more, but it does also have a bigger impact than an article because, video has that bigger impact. And so I was shocked at how many people wanted to buy a video. Now that it's played out, it makes more sense that like, oh yeah, they want to get their customer on video, and video is a great way, and getting a video testimonial is powerful for a health IT company, or getting their executive out there and really showing their thought leadership, and especially a dynamic executive that has strong opinions, that's powerful. Or when they want to feature a partnership that they're doing with some other company, it's a video is a nice way to share that, and then their partner shares the fact that they're partners and things like that. So like now it makes sense to me why that was so powerful and why people had budget to be able to do something like that. And I think we packaged it in a nice way. Of course, over time we've learned a lot on how to package that for them and making sure it's valuable to them. But that was a surprise to me, like that so many people wanted access to video, and maybe it was that they didn't want to do it themselves. I don't know. I think that was an interesting thing as far as the success of it, right? And obviously drove us to be able to do what we do, because that's a lot of people always ask what's the model at healthcare IT today, and that's obviously part of it is being able to tell good stories. But for us, and I always look at the whole paid model as about priority versus the content itself. It's paying for priority so that your story is told rather than someone else. And so I think that's just a powerful thing that we've seen, and that surprised me as well.
And we talk about putting all this out there, but then, I think we were unsure if people were going to actually watch them and what the views were going to be like. And, you promise these things and you hope that people are watching it. And, I think at first you think, are people even, like you said at the beginning of this, are people even going to care? People are going to listen. So can you guys talk to me about some of the views and some of the stats that were really kind of surprising when we looked back at everything that we've done?
Yeah, I think the biggest surprise is I don't think any of us can predict which ones are going to pop. Like the only exception is like if you mention Epic, it pops, or if
Right.
there's like the rubberneckers that want to see the accident when there's a fine or a violation, or something like that, right? Other than that, like we almost can't predict what's going to really blow it out of the water. But that said, I mean, I think it is astounding, right? Like just throwing some of the numbers out there across the 500 episodes that we did, and this includes podcast downloads, this includes video views, social video views, etc., right? So across all of those, we've had like 750,000 download views,
Wow.
etc., right? Which it's one of those things that is really beautiful about doing this type of stuff and doing it at this volume. You don't even realize the impact that you've had, right? Like I don't think any of us would have guessed 750,000 off of 500 episodes, right? And so I think that's just like a powerful example of it, right? That you see, and it's amazing to see how many of the different videos and stuff that we share from these podcasts and how they pop in particular. Colin's right that there's a certain audience that will subscribe to the podcast and listen to every episode. There's some that will follow you on social and listen to an episode. There's some that are your YouTube subscribers, they listen to it. And there's some that are seeing the clips on social media and watching those clips and kind of consuming those. And the way the social platforms have pushed those types of videos on social, that was a surprise for me as well. As far as how many views, I mean, it's regular that they pop to 2, 3, 4, or 5,000 views for an individual episode. And so I mean, I think in aggregate, it's like, wow, a 750,000, views. That's a lot of people consuming this content and hearing what's been shared by these experts that we interview. But then also in individual, like seeing them pop and then hearing the stories from different customers and different people that we've interviewed that talk about, hey, I remember one CIO that was on the podcast. I remember him saying, "John, do you realize the reach that this has?" And in one respect, I kind of do, and in another respect, it's like, no, he's like, man, I got outreached by so many people after I did it, and it was like, oh, cool, it's interesting because you do see some of it, but like because you see it in the aggregate numbers, but you also don't know the individual impact that it's having.
Yeah, and to one point that you said, we share this kind of across multiple platforms. So we share it on LinkedIn, we share it on YouTube, we share it on our podcast, we share it on X or Twitter, and TikTok and Instagram. So we kind of share it on a multitude of platforms. And I think what was interesting, and maybe Colin, you can talk to a little bit more about this, but we saw a slight maybe a level out of Twitter and kind of an increase on LinkedIn on specifically kind of clips and things that we were and podcasts that we were sharing. I think we've seen it on our personal accounts. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that increase that we've seen on specific platforms?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that we realized early on is, in order to make the videos, the podcasts, and successful, is we had to do what we did with the articles. Like, it's not good enough to just publish an article, put it on a website, and expect people to come and find it. I mean,
If you
that doesn't
build it, they
work.
won't come.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to tell them to.
It's hard enough for a publication to do that, but I can't imagine, being a company trying to do that, right? Like, you're just posting up a blog. We all know that that won't really draw a lot. You're not going to get ranked on the first page of Google and so forth, right? So you have to do a lot of your own promotion, and the cheapest, most effective way to do that is to do it via social media, right? Is to post a link to those articles. So we took that same model and applied it to video and to the podcasts, and that's what really helps to drive the numbers that John spoke about, right? It's the fact that we do share an excerpt. So we cut out like a minute or 2 minutes out of the 10-minute interview. We post that as a clip. And thankfully, LinkedIn, as well as some of the other platforms other than X, has really put a priority on those kinds of shares.
Mm-hmm.
So when someone shares a clip, they boost that a little bit, right? They put it in more of the people's feeds. They rank it a little bit more highly. They recommend it a little bit more. So I think that's really helped to drive the engagement on those other platforms. X used to do this, like when they were one of the first that introduced short video clips, but they didn't really prioritize it as much over other content on that platform. So, and then in general, as people kind of left that platform to move to others, we saw that migration in our numbers. So of course now, yeah, we are seeing a lot more engagement on LinkedIn and Instagram than we are over on X, but all of them still very much drive viewers and listeners to the content. And that's at least being part of our success, right? Is just that continual sharing of all that information out there.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Like LinkedIn does 3x the number of views, when we did a study, of the other social platforms, at least for us, which would make sense because we're a B2B type of, content, right? And so that makes sense. And we did see a falling off from X, but I actually think we've seen a flattening of X too. So now in my experience and what I've seen, is that X is kind of flattened out. And so, it's not what it used to be, but I don't think it's getting worse now either. So what's the problem? And that's the problem for X. We'll see how this plays out over time. Can X re-engage it and have it take off again? I'm not sure confident, that it will, right? But it is, pretty flat where it's at. So I think that's interesting as well. But, and I think it's just beautiful to see, when you look at this, and why did we like X or Twitter, I guess, when it was first launched? And for me, it was about the discovery of new people and new perspectives that
Mhm.
was available. And I think that's one of the beautiful things of this interviews podcast is we're able to share 500, or we've had a few repeats, but 400, 500, different people's voices that you probably wouldn't have heard otherwise unless you like bumped into them at a conference or something like that, right? And so I think, in some ways we've seen some of that with the interviews podcast where people are like, hey, you're sharing some really interesting stuff, kind of like the early days of Twitter, where you'd find a Rasu and you're like, wow, how is it possible that I get to interact with someone of Rasu's caliber and experience, right? In some ways, we offer that with the interviews podcast, which I think is really cool. And I've heard that from other people, is they're like, yeah, and to be fair, they're like, yeah, you have a few clunkers here or there, right? Like a few interviews that aren't as good as others, but for the most part, it's fun to hear what's really happening on the front lines and for us to discover someone new that we didn't know about or a new product that we hadn't heard about. And I think that is the exciting part of this is that it's new discoveries, new ideas or connections that maybe you didn't know before, which is why the social media was so exciting in the beginning. And I think it's still today for the interviews podcast.
So let's not talk about the clunkers, but let's talk about some of your favorite interviews that you both have, or that you both remember that you both have done. Maybe Colin, we'll start with you.
Oh, put me on the spot first. Wow, there's so many. I mean, every interview is unique. And that's what makes it so much fun. We do we
You have
do
to pick your
try to,
favorite child, Colin. That's what
yeah,
she's saying. She
exactly.
said, "Do you
Yeah.
have a favorite child?"
And don't they always say that there is a favorite child, even though you say there isn't?
Whether you say there is or not.
I think it depends on the moment, right?
True.
Like what they've done recently.
Very true.
But,
Well, I think that's true
but
with
no,
podcasts too.
Yeah.
there's been some good one. I mean, all of the interviews have always been unique, and the questions we always ask are fun, and it's fun to talk to people live. So I tend to remember the ones we do in person versus the ones on Zoom, just because you're with them and you're sitting down together. It's a lot more fun that way. But I think the ones that stand out for me are the ones that I've done with Dr. Garrity from Esri. GIS and healthcare is one of those topics that I just love, and I find it so fascinating. So, and she is brilliant. So, whenever I have a chance to speak with her and do an interview with her, I always learn something new, and I always want to spend like another half hour talking to her about stuff. And she's got so many stories to tell. So, I really enjoy those interviews I've done with her. I think I've done about 3 or 4 with her. It's always fun to interview my friend Rasu, right? Dr. Shrestha over at Atrium Health. He's amazing. So those interviews as well have been awesome. But as John said, some of the most fun interviews are the ones you bump into someone in the exhibit hall and you just say, "Hey, let's hop on camera." And then they've got a story they really want to tell, and it turns out to be super fascinating. So I enjoy those ones where we're just sort of right in the exhibit hall. We just set up the camera and we start going. Those have been some of the most fun for me.
Yeah, I would say there obviously the recency bias, if you will, of your most recent kids. So we could extend the analogy the wrong way, but like all the ambient voice ones for me were super interesting, and seeing how that technology is being approached by a variety of companies from Nabla to Nuance to ambient healthcare, which that one blew up, and they're just a small company that's working in this space as well, right? We did a Suno AI one with, that at HIMSS that, really blew up as well. So I think some of those stand out, of course, because it was this discovery and is like it's an ongoing discovery of the ambient clinical voice space and how that's going to impact healthcare. So I mean, those are the recency bias. If I dig a little deeper into the 500, one big standout was the long interview I did with the CEO of Meditech, Howard Messing, and we did it to celebrate their 50th year of Meditech. So, 50 years is and crazy, like it's hard to, we kind of went through like each decade how they redid their system. Like that was fascinating. And Howard is not a guy who likes the limelight, and but he was willing to do it as kind of the celebration of the 50th. So that was a really unique one. It makes me wonder, should we do more of these deep dive ones? A teaser alert, I might be trying some of those. But there were a few others, like I loved the founder of Teledoc. That was just a really, and it did really well because he, was post that, and Teladoc had acquired Livongo and gone public, and it was post COVID. And so it was blowing up. And hearing his original, like, this is what it was like trying to convince them to do telemedicine pre-pandemic, and how do we make a career of it and all that. That was super fascinating to hear and to experience. So I think that was another like standout one for me, is these founders. I love founder stories too, right? Like I'd say, there's a whole series of those that I could talk about, because when you're a founder, you know the problem area so well that it makes it for a fun interview.
Cool. I think some of the ones that I remember, are more on the sway side, interviewing some of our healthcare marketers. And, we interviewed a lot of our award winners, our Sway.Health award winners. So it was nice. And it was kind of post-pandemic, but kind of still during the pandemic when people still weren't meeting up and we still weren't going to conferences. So it was nice to, hop on Zoom and talk to these folks about, why they won the award and what it meant to them, and just really kind of connect and hear their story, kind of like a founder story, but kind of their origin story and how they kind of have progressed and developed to where they are today.
I always find it fun when I interview someone who's like, in their past they were a radio DJ, or they were journalists and now they're on the other side. Like that's always fun too. We've had a few of those over the years, and they always come on, they're like, this is pretty fun. This is what, and they tell you again that origin story. So at the end of the day, maybe that's the best part, is hearing people's personal experience and in their own, maybe that's another one too, is when they share why they got into healthcare. Almost everyone has that. Oh, my mom had this, or my friend had this, and now I want to make a difference. And so that's always powerful.
And, we talk to a lot of people, we go to a lot of conferences. So what has been the chatter, or what have been some of the things that people have said about the impact of the podcast that you've kind of heard in your travels, or your maybe most recent interviews?
It's
I think,
interesting. It happens a
yeah.
lot, right? I think Colin and I both have a lot of stories there. I think what's fascinating for me is the difference between, when I'd written 7,000 articles, people would come up and be like, "Hey, John, I read you," and stuff like that, right? And or you'd talk to them and you'd say, "Oh, this website," and they're like, "Oh, I know that one. Okay, cool. Yeah, yeah, I've seen some of your stuff." Whereas now with video, it's like they come up and they're like, "Hey, John, I know you." And then I'm like, wait, should I know this person? You're almost embarrassed because you're like, wait, should I? And they usually save you, like they're like, well, I don't know you, but I listen to you. I've seen all your videos and I appreciate what you do. So I don't know. That would be, I say, the biggest change and shift and the impact I've seen, that I think is interesting. And sorry, Colin, I cut you off. Go for it.
No, no, the video and the podcast definitely has had a lot more, I'll call it real world impact, with a larger group of people. I still remember the days when we were doing things on Twitter, and you would walk around the halls, and other people who are on Twitter and very active, we would recognize each other, right? We'd see each other and say hello. And that was one of the best parts of being at conferences, was suddenly being able to meet these people that you'd only gotten to know online. But with video, that is sort of taken that to like 3 or 4 to 5x. Like, so many more people now stop me and come up and say, "Hey, I recognize you," and from the podcast or from the videos that you do. And the diversity of people who are saying that is much larger. Whereas before it was a smaller community, right? It was very similar minded folks. You were all sort of on X. I've had so many salespeople recently come up to me and say, "Hey, listen, I love your podcast because it's what I use to stay up to speed on the industry."
Hmm.
I've had a lot of marketers come up and say, "Hey, I really love the fact that you're covering this sort of space, because we don't really have another outlet that's really covering it to the depth that you guys do. So I think the reaction has always been very surprising to me. I've been grateful for it. It's been amazing. But just that diversity of people who are listening and watching that's really the one thing that strikes me from all the reactions that we get in the conferences that we go to.
Yeah, I'd throw two more stories in there. One related to the salesperson one. It is interesting how many salespeople, one, to keep up, to have topics that they can use in their stuff, but actually how they use the videos too, right? I remember a sales guy coming up to me and being like, "Hey, John, I used that video and I closed this deal because I was able to share our story with the prospect that we were working with, and then seeing our other customer and hearing them talk about it made a really big impact, and we were able to close a deal because of that." Like I love hearing that, and I think that's something we've learned, is that many of these videos are great for sales enablement, which I don't think was necessarily our intent when we first started, right? We were telling good stories, and then we saw, oh, it is, which I think is part of our vision of healthcare IT today, is how do we put out the good that's happening in health IT so that we can spread it, because the ingenuity and the innovation that's happening in healthcare IT isn't spread evenly. And so when I hear a salesperson say, "Hey, we were able to help out an organization and be able to make a sell," of course, but help them out with a solution that makes an impact for them, that's always a powerful thing. But the
And
other
I mean,
one
we
that
have to, I was going to say, you have to tell the story about the guy on the plane.
All right, I'll tell two more stories then. Yeah, so I was flying to HIMSS, and I got a text from actually a PR person who's like, "Hey, John, the guy next to me has been binging Healthcare IT Today episodes for the last 3 hours." And, and I was like, so we're texting on the plane, right? I texted her back. I was like, "Oh, does he just want to sleep on the flight? Is that what, like?" And she's
But what
like,
a great
"No, John."
testament to what Colin was saying about someone trying to keep up with, the industry and just kind of using, our assets to be able to do that. I mean, that's fulfilling in anything, right?
Yeah. And that's what she said. She's like, "No, he's listening intently." So I forced her to find out who it was. And, and said he was just trying to keep up. And exactly,
Love
just
it.
like you said. The other one that's fascinating is I was at Chime and I was walking down the swag line, looking at they have tables with all the swag on it, and you can kind of just pick and choose. And the CIO, I mean, the big guy, 6'4" guy, right? He's like, "Hey, John, I know you." And I'm like, "Oh, well, yeah, it's classic, just like I said." And he's like, "Well, I listen to you and Colin every morning, and I hear what you're saying, right?" And I was like, "Well, that's awesome, and I appreciate that." And so, I talked to him a bit about what he was doing. But here's the fun part. It turns out that about a year and a half later, one of the products that he used, he was a CIO in the Midwest. One of the products he used invited him to be on our podcast as part of their sponsored podcast.
No
And
way.
so, he actually now is on the podcast. And when he hopped on and we got on there and we were starting the interview, he's like, "John," he's like, "this is so surreal." He's like, hearing this every morning when he's like, "I get my cup of coffee and I have my dose of healthcare IT today." He said the fact that I'm on it now, he's like, it just feels so surreal. So that was a pretty cool, like, full circle kind of moment. And he did an awesome episode. So, I appreciate him.
Yeah, and I think people I think just relate and resonate to both of you. That's what I hear at conferences, is that you guys are real, you're talking about, things in the industry that are important, but you're doing it in an authentic and real way. So I think that's why people really love listening and resonate with the videos.
Well, as Colin says, he's a health IT believer, right? Like
There you
that's
go. Hashtag believer.
Yeah, and
So
I think
talked a lot about, the origins and the interviews that we've done, but what is on the docket next for the podcast?
well, I think first of all, way more conferences, right? No, I'm
Yeah.
kidding. I
is
think
that
that,
possible?
I know that's the comment that I get from a lot of people. Like, how many more conferences can you guys possibly squeeze in a year? We already go to so many. It's basically every other week or every week during the seasons. So
Brittany better suit
no,
up, huh?
Yeah.
yeah, no. For me, I mean, for me, there's a few things. I think having done 500 now, I'd like to think we're getting a little bit better at our craft, and getting to getting quicker to the deeper insights faster in those interviews, right? That we do. I think if I look back at some of the earlier podcasts that I've done, I think I maybe have spent too much time asking people about, how did you get into the business, and tell me a little bit more about this or that before getting into the meat of why we wanted to have them on the podcast in the first place. So I still remember the first few ones I did. It was common for mine to go about 35, 40 minutes, right? And over that period, I've managed to cut it down to so it's a lot more punchy, a lot more impactful. So I'd like to think going forward that will continue that kind of evolution of improving of what we do. And then just the technology has gotten so much better, right? Like, John, you were talking about your first videos were done with a cell phone, right? Now we're walking around with like two cameras and tripods and like wireless microphones, and we're getting better at how we edit them, and our crew is getting better at how we're editing them. And we're getting fancier in terms of our transitions and lower thirds. And so I think people can expect that as well, as to continue to see us evolve as the technology improves, as new trends come up in terms of video editing and so forth. But also, lastly, I'll say, I think because of the people we've interviewed, because of the stories we've told, the quality of the people that we're getting on the program has just improved. And I don't mean that the ones we've had before are bad. It's just more that we're having many more provider organizations now being willing to talk to us, where I think before they were a little hesitant to talk to the press. But now they've seen the stories that we tell and the good news that we're trying to spread about the great work that people are doing, and they're much more willing to hop on camera with us. So I'm hoping over the next 500 episodes, you'll hear a lot more of those kinds of case studies and stories from people who are actually doing the work at the organizations. So
Yeah.
that for me is what's kind of ahead.
That's really interesting to think about. Like, one that we often want to highlight the stories of people that aren't being heard, right? We do that a fair bit. I've certainly done plenty of those stories that are fun, and they appreciate being heard and having their story told. I think that's beautiful. But I think, to your point, some of the people we've had on a couple different times, and by doing that, you're able to dive in deeper into the topic, rather than, okay, this is, I often tell people, and especially, this happens with companies who buy like a whole series of interviews with us in particular, where it's like, yeah, the first one, like, that lays the groundwork for what how you approach stuff, and what is your frame of thought. But then as we do more and more, we can dive deeper into some of the details and nuances of it. And I think people really appreciate that. It was funny, I think, that you said more conferences, because I actually think that in some ways that is true. And we've seen that growth. You know uh, the growth of number of companies that want us to come to their user conference, which we
Mm.
love, because we love hearing the users. To your point, we loved having the providers on and talking about their actual firsthand experience with it. Like, I think that's going to be a huge growth for us over the next one, which is us being hired by these health IT companies to go to their user conference or their user focus group, or what, their advisory board meetings, to do the interviews with them. And those are really fun, because we get to tell a bunch of stories about a very specific use case. And I think both of us enjoy those extremely, because they are the people with boots on the ground dealing with the day to day, as opposed to kind of this sky, pie in the sky kind of thinking. And so, I think that will be a growth area as well. And luckily, there's a lot coming to Vegas over the next year. So, even the big companies, every cloud company is doing an event in Vegas. So we'll be hitting those up as well. So I think that's interesting. And then just one other idea that I think is worth exploring. I teased it with the Meditech one and interviewing Howard Messing, but I think it would be interesting to do the opposite of what Colin said, which I think that is our nature, is to, and especially mine in particular, is to be short and sweet and to get to the meat right away. But I think a deep dive with some very, thoughtful people who know a space really well. I'm interested to know, how would our audience react to that? So it may be, yeah, anyway, I won't tease it too much anymore, but I'd like to try that with a couple people and see how it plays out. And, almost the Joe Rogan style, where it's like,
Mm.
let's dive in and let's get into the stuff that, like we were hanging out over drinks at a conference for an hour, where you get to like, you finally get to the meat 45 minutes in because you've already done the baseline.
Well, some exciting things. I'm excited to be along for the ride. I was just waiting for Colin to say, "Oh yeah, 500 interviews in 500 days," and I was my eyeballs might pop out of my head.
Actually, we probably do that between Vive and Hymns. We probably,
True.
it's not that hard
Very
Yeah, I
anymore.
was
true.
gonna say we did 150 interviews in 6 days between Vibe and him, so
Yeah, so
that's
maybe
my
it's not
pace.
an unlikely thing or an unlikely goal.
Well, you did most of them too, Brittany. So credit
Yeah, I
to
know. I was
you,
gonna say,
you and Bonnie.
Brittany, you were responsible for most of those interviews that we did at him. So I think that the crazy goal would be 500 at a single event. I mean, that would be an
Well,
amazing thing. So, but we have to aim for that next year.
I'll just have to make sure my voice is clear for those
Less
for my
partying.
new voiceover actor career.
Yep. It's been fun though, right? I mean, I think that's the cool part is, the number of health IT publications has been diminishing, or
Mhm.
consolidating, or whatever else, right? Disappearing. And so, a lot of these health IT companies are like, how do we get the word out about what we're doing? And so it is really gratifying to be able to work with them, to work with the provider organizations, to share their pains and their struggles and what they're dealing with, and being able to make a difference to help someone. I heard a CIO recently tell me like, "Hey, John, the reason we're going and checking out this health IT solution is because of listening to your podcast and hearing you talk
Mm.
about it a bunch of times." And yeah, that's cool, right? It's nice to know that you're making a difference for people that haven't been heard, for healthcare provider organizations that need good solutions. So I think that's the most exciting part about what we do.
Well, thank you guys. Any other closing thoughts before we close out?
No, other than say, can't wait for the next 500.
Yeah, and thanks everyone that listens, and that follows, that likes, subscribes, rates us on iTunes, etc. We always appreciate the listeners, because if they weren't listening, we wouldn't have a job. We'd be searching for one. So I just appreciate the community that provides feedback, comments, that listens, etc. So thanks to all of them.
Well, this was fun, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
Yeah, this
thanks,
has been
Brittany.
fun. We have to do it again. We'll have to do it again on our next milestone.
Yeah. Off to a
Mhm.
thousand.
Off to a thousand.
We'll do it there. And I guess this is the best way to wrap this up. That everyone should go search for Healthcare IT Today on your favorite podcasting application, and be sure to like and subscribe.
There
Well,
you
I was going to
go.
say
Nailed
you
it.
can't end it without saying like and subscribe, John. That's
Awesome. Well, I'll end it this way. I'll a big thank you to Colin, Brittany, the rest of the Healthcare IT Today team that really make it possible for us to be able to do this. I think that was the other thing that we've done over the last year, is like, how do we keep producing quality content at this scale? And credit to all the Healthcare IT Today team. There's a whole team behind us of I think there's 20 people on the team that help make this happen. The sharing on social, the putting it in the newsletter, all of those things. There's a whole team behind us. So thanks to all of them, and thanks to all the listeners. Appreciate you, and we'll catch you on episode 501.